And the boat and I were immediately and completely submerged under about 8 or 10 feet of water. I knew that I had been underwater already too long to still be alive. My spirit rose up and out of the river. I saw my body being pulled to shore. I saw the guys start CPR, and I could look at my body and recognize that that was my body, that represented my life here.
We were in an accident where another horse ran into my horse. She reared up, flipped over backwards with me on her back, and fell across my body. As she hit my chest, I immediately left my body. I was up 30, 40 feet in the air.
I was looking down at an airplane that had crashed. I had seen a body over here that was dead, but I knew this body really well. Right then, it hit me. I'm not in my body. There's my body, but here's me.
I've always been fascinated with these near-death experiences, and by near-death, I don't mean like they almost got hit by a car. I mean like dead. At first, I was very skeptical of these, but I'll tell you, after studying over 1,000 of these near-death experiences, it's changed my mind.
I was in this experience for what felt to me like many hours. But in fact, the entire thing was probably 30 minutes.
It was like we had this wave of light under our feet pushing us forward, and it was almost as if I could see the stars go by.
I began to see a small, bright, brilliant glow that got bigger and bigger and bigger.
So how do we know these people were truly dead? Doctors, cardiologists, oncologists have actually been able to look at medical records to show, yeah, these people were truly dead by all the ways that we would clinically talk about death.
The 9 wheels of the driver's side of the truck just rolled over the car. So I was just really killed instantly, blunt force trauma. They pronounced me dead on the scene.
As to how long I was clinically dead without brain function or heart function, at least 30 minutes.
According to the medical records, it was 1 hour and 45 minutes that I was not breathing or heart beating during that time frame. So in the sense of a skeptic, I always tell them, you may say I didn't go to heaven, but you can't say I didn't die because it didn't have any brain wave at that time.
That fact that the near-death experiences are occurring during that time, that consciousness should be a blank slate, is medically inexplicable. It should be impossible for them to be remembering anything.
Having looked at my medical records, corroborated as many details as I could about the scene at the river, I ultimately concluded that my experience was outside the realm of science and outside the realm of medicine.
Scientists postulate there must be at least 5 dimensions to make sense of some of the things science is discovering. Is it so crazy to think about what comes after this life? Welcome to this 6-part series on what's after life. I'm so glad you decided to join in this conversation. In it, you're going to hear from very credible people, doctors, college professors, commercial airline pilots, and other professionals who only lose credibility in their profession by talking about their experience, and yet they say it's the most real thing that ever happened to them. I'm John Burke, and after 30 years of researching over 1,000 of these accounts, I wrote the book Imagine Heaven and a shorter booklet called What's Afterlife, conveying more of the evidence of the afterlife you just heard. I'll be your guide through this discussion on a topic that I think is relevant to all of us. Though we all avoid thinking about it, one day we will all pass from this life into whatever's after, or nothing. But one day for sure, all the pretty flowers, all the nice words people say at funerals, they will be for you. And people do say such nice things at funerals. You know, sad to think I'll miss mine by just a few days. But this topic, it's arguably the most important in life. Because if this life is just the beginning of something more real than anything we've experienced yet, I mean, that has implications for how we live, how we love, and the very purpose of life. And whether you're approaching this as a skeptic or a believer or somewhere in between, we want these discussions to be a safe place. Feel free to disagree, listen respectfully to different opinions, and keep an open mind. Because that's really where we learn and grow, when we wrestle through new possibilities and new ideas. You know, that was my experience. It's how I got interested in this topic. My dad was dying of cancer, and at the time, I didn't really believe in God or the afterlife or any of it. But I picked up a book someone had given my dad. It was actually the first research written on near-death experiences, or NDEs. I read it cover to cover that night, and at the end said, whoa, maybe the afterlife is real. I mean, maybe there really is a God, and if so, I've got to find out more. Because I kept thinking, how do I explain so many people clinically dead, resuscitated by modern medicine, then saying very similar things, and as I would later discover, all around the world. I've since gone from a career in engineering to become an author, researcher, and a pastor out of a desire to help people learn what I learned, what changed my mind. My research centered on the common threads NDEers share, what they tell us, and more importantly, what that means today. You'll meet some of these people in the video series and many more in the What's Afterlife booklet. The Gallup poll found that 1 out of 25 Americans has had a near-death experience. That means close to 13 million Americans had an experience like this. And more than 900 scholarly articles have been written in prestigious peer-reviewed journals like the Journal of the American Medical Association, The Lancet, Europe's prestigious medical journal, Psychiatry, and many others. We'll walk through a series of questions over the weeks to come, and as we do, some important filters will help us understand what kind of science applies here, as well as the limits of science. This week especially, we're going to zero in on whether there really is reliable data to support the accounts of NDEers. You know, NDEers are trying to explain something extra-dimensional. I mean, imagine if your experience of life were being lived on a flat, two-dimensional black and white picture on the wall. Then when you die, you leave that flat, two-dimensional picture and you're brought out into a three-dimensional room of color. But then after experiencing a three-dimensional world of color, what if you got pressed back into that flat black and white world? How would you describe 3 dimensions of color in flat 2D black and white terms? That's the challenge NDEers face. And sometimes they sound odd as they grasp for language that makes sense in our finite, limited dimensions. Now, I, like many of you, am a skeptical engineer type. So I get it if some of you are thinking, how do you know these stories aren't just made up, or the lingering effects of drugs, or a hallucination, or a dying brain? Well, the evidence has actually convinced many skeptical doctors. Let's hear from one of them.
People may wonder, are near-death experiences falsified? How do we know they're real? Well, all near-death researchers that I'm aware of believe that vanishingly few near-death experiences are shared that are falsified. Some people have wondered if near-death experiences are due to drugs or anesthetic agents. In having studied over 4,000 near-death experiences, the great majority of these people that had them were not taking any psychotropic, that is, brain-acting medication at the time of the experience. So there's no chance that drugs could account for what's observed in near-death experiences. Some skeptics have proposed that near-death experiences are due to hypoxia, which is low blood oxygen levels. Well, that's a reasonable hypothesis because, after all, at the time of a life-threatening event, typically you are going to have reduced oxygen levels in the blood as a result of the trauma or injury that led to that close brush with death. In any other altered type of human consciousness, dreams, hallucinations, psychotic events, you typically have confused sensorium. Experiences may skip around in dreams that are very common. You really have that hypo or decreased lucidity, and that's completely different in near-death experiences, which are hyper or increased lucid, tends to be very logically and ordered. I can't find a single skeptical explanation of near-death experience that any reasonable, well-informed person would accept as explaining near-death experience. One of the strongest lines of evidence for the reality of near-death experience is they shouldn't happen at all. At the time of a cardiac arrest, when your heart stops, well, of course, immediately, blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after that event, the EEG, electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain electrical activity, goes absolutely flat. It should be impossible to have a lucid, organized experience at that time, and yet by the hundreds, people have reported near-death experiences immediately following a cardiac arrest, and that is medically inexplicable.
Another skeptical cardiologist, Dr. Michael Sabom, studied the fascinating case of Pam Reynolds, the singer-songwriter who had a brain aneurysm. To treat it, Pam's body temperature was lowered to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or 10 degrees Celsius. Her breathing and heartbeat were stopped. The blood was drained from her head completely. Her eyes were closed with tape, and small earplugs with speakers emitting 100 decibel clicks were put into her ears so that they could ensure that she had a flat EEG or a non-responsive brain. In other words, she couldn't see, hear, and she had no brain waves. And yet, after recovery, she claimed she had died and left her body and watched the surgery from up above. She described how she saw the saw that they used to open up her skull, and it didn't look like what she thought it would. It looked like an electric toothbrush, and she described a plastic case with blades. She accurately described a tense situation when a female doctor couldn't find a vein in her leg and was told by a male doctor, try the other leg. All this checked out, yet how could she have known? Dr. Janice Holden, professor of psychology, studied 93 cases of NDEs like Pam. She found that 92% of the observations that NDEers made were completely accurate. Another 6% only had minor variations. One case out of the 93 was inaccurate. Pam and thousands of others like her demonstrate that when people die, they leave their bodies, but they have a new body, a spiritual body. Though modern resuscitation techniques are today revealing lots more of these stories, they're actually not new. Plato wrote in the Republic about a soldier who had a near-death experience. The Tibetan Book of the Dead talks about some aspects similar to modern NDE accounts. The writers of the Jewish scriptures report several resuscitations, and the Christian New Testament records Jesus raising Jairus' daughter and Lazarus from the dead. Paul, who wrote many of the New Testament books, may have had an NDE when he was stoned to death in Lystra. He revived and later writes exactly what NDEers report around the globe today. He said, "I was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. But I do know that I was caught up to paradise, and I heard things so astounding they cannot be expressed in words." Later he says, "Our bodies are buried in brokenness, but they will be raised in glory. They're buried in weakness, but they'll be raised in strength. They're buried as natural human bodies, but they will be raised as spiritual bodies." A new spiritual body is just one of the common experiences. What are others? Well, after people die, they say they leave their bodies, often observe their resuscitation, but they still have a body. We're ourselves, more ourselves than we've ever been. And not just with 5 senses, more like 50 senses, they say. Commonly, they feel a peace like never before. They travel, some through a tunnel or what they describe as a pathway to a place so beautiful as to defy description. Not unlike Earth, with mountains, streams, trees, flowers, but with a vibrancy and a life that they just know this is what I was created for. Many encounter a God of light who is unconditional love and personal, even humorous, knows them inside out, and then many get a life review with this God of love, and he lets them relive their lives to understand why love matters most. At that point, they're told it's not their time. They still have a purpose on earth to fulfill, and they're resuscitated. They want to share this out of this world experience, but struggle to find words. And when people hear it and respond like they're delusional, they often stop talking openly about it. So what does all this mean? And if this is true, how might it affect our lives today? That's really what I want us to think about and discuss. Here's some questions to get you going. And remember, it's okay to have different opinions, listen respectfully, keep an open mind. Well, I hope you had a great discussion. You know, we have so much more to get into, so I hope you'll join us back next week as we explore the evidence for relational reunions in the life to come. I mean, is it true that we meet loved ones who have gone on before us? Do they look the same? Do we hug, kiss? What about our beloved pets? Well, we'll talk about all that. See you next time.
When I looked up, there's my family. My grandmother Mary was out front. She was bright, she had a big smile and pure joy.
My family appeared. One of them put their hand out.
I knew her as an old woman when I was a kid. When she was in heaven, she looked to be in her 30s.